There is a tablet in the British Museum that is barely readable. Fire reached it somewhere between when it was made and when it was found. Fired a second time, by accident, by the same catastrophe that destroyed the library containing it. What survived is cracked, partial, reconstructed in places by scholars who had to infer missing sections from parallel texts found elsewhere. Most of it is in Akkadian, written in cuneiform pressed into clay, copied from an older source that no longer exists. The oldest surviving copies of this tradition date to around 1650 BCE, made during the Old Babylonian period, copied from traditions older still. What this tablet says is not what you were taught. The flood is in it. The survival is in it. But what is also in it, sitting in the text with complete precision, almost never the thing that gets discussed, is a legal loophole. A god who had agreed not to warn anyone found a mechanism to warn someone without technically doing it. He walked to a reed fence in the night and spoke his warning not to the man sleeping behind it, but to the wall itself. What the text records is something like this. Wall, listen to me. Read wall, pay attention. The exact rendering shifts across translations, but the structure never does. The man heard. The god remained clean. The oath was unbroken. The question that should immediately follow is this: why would a god need legal cover? That question is not mystical. It is institutional. And once you ask it seriously, the oldest flood narrative in human history stops being a story about divine wrath and starts being something considerably more uncomfortable. Here is what most people were told. The flood myth appears across three primary ancient texts: the Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis Epic, and Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Scholars classify it as Mesopotamian religious cosmology, a foundational narrative of the ancient Near East, a cultural precursor to the biblical Noah story. The structure is clean. The gods decide humanity has become too numerous, too loud, too inconvenient. A flood is arranged. One man is chosen. He is warned by divine grace and survives. The rest of humanity is destroyed. The gods witness the devastation, and some of them feel something like regret. This is the version that got taught. It is in the textbooks, the comparative religion courses, the museum placard language. It is framed as myth, ancient people encoding their experience of the world through divine narrative, grappling with mortality, obedience, and survival. That version is not exactly false, but it is structured to avoid the most important thing in the text. The fracture is not the flood itself. The fracture is what happened before the first drop of water fell. Before the rains came, the senior gods, the assembly called the Anunnaki, convened and made a formal decision. No god would warn humanity. The destruction was institutional, collective, and bound by sworn agreement. Enlil, the sky god, the god of storm and command authority and hierarchical dominance, engineered the plan. The council agreed. The oath was taken. Enki signed it. And then Enki walked to a wall and spoke into it anyway. The text is not ambiguous here. The language is specific. Enki does not address Atrahasis, the man, the survivor, directly. He addresses the fence. What passed through the reeds was not, in the legal grammar of this document, a warning from a god to a man. It was a god speaking to construction material. The surviving human becomes, in that formulation, an accidental beneficiary of a conversation between a deity and a wall. That precision is not mythology. That is the deliberate recording of a workaround. This changes what the story is about. The oldest flood narrative in the written record is not primarily about water or punishment or mercy. It is about a member of a governing council who held knowledge the ruling authority had sealed, and who found a mechanism to transmit that knowledge without technically violating the institutional prohibition. This is a story about what happens when someone inside the system knows what the system has decided no one may know. Hold that, because the physical object matters here. One of the key Atrahasis tablets now in the British Museum carries a colophon, a scribal signature at the bottom. The scribe identified himself and identified the source tablet from which his copy was made. This is not oral tradition softened by generations of retelling. This is a copied, recorded, institutionally transmitted text. Someone made an original. Someone else copied it. Someone after that copied the copy. Each time, inside scribal schools attached to the same temple hierarchies that administered land, grain distribution, water rights, and labor across ancient Mesopotamia. Temple scribes copied what they were permitted to copy, and they copied the loophole. They preserved, across centuries and multiple parallel traditions, the story of a god who broke the spirit of an institutional oath while maintaining the technical letter of it. They kept the reed fence in the text. They kept the words spoken to the wall. They kept the legal precision of Enki's maneuver intact and readable for anyone willing to look at it plainly. The question the official version has never needed to ask is what it means that they did. To begin answering that, you need to understand what Enki and Enlil actually represent in Mesopotamian institutional and political geography. The divine conflict in the flood narrative is not arbitrary. Enlil was the god of Nippur, the dominant administrative and priestly center of ancient Mesopotamia, the seat of command authority, the city whose blessing gave divine sanction to kings across the region. Enlil's character is storm, edict, punishment from above. He is the voice of the ruling structure made divine. Enki was the god of Eridu, the oldest city in the tradition, built at the edge of the marshes where the rivers met the sea, associated with underground freshwater, irrigation engineering, the technical arts, and the scribal craft itself. Enlil's institution held administrative and political dominance. Enki's institution held the technical knowledge infrastructure. This is not a metaphysical distinction. In a civilization built entirely on managed water, where irrigation canals determined whether cities ate or starved, where flood control systems were the central engineering challenge of existence in the Tigris-Euphrates basin, the distance between those who commanded and those who understood how to make the land productive was a real and consequential division of power. The god who decides to destroy everything is the god of command authority. The god who finds a way to preserve the mechanism of survival is the god of technical knowledge and craft. This is not solely a story about mercy versus cruelty. It encodes something that looks more like a memory of what happened when the administrative hierarchy decided to reset the order of things. And the knowledge tradition found a way to survive the reset. That is the first reinterpretation. The story is already larger than it appeared a moment ago. Now step back further. The survival of this specific text, with the loophole intact, with the legal mechanism preserved, with the wall speech recorded in full procedural detail, is itself a form of evidence. Temple scribal schools did not copy carelessly. The fact that the Atrahasis tradition survived in multiple copies across multiple centuries, in Akkadian and Sumerian versions both, with the structural content of Enki's workaround consistently retained, means the people doing the copying chose not to suppress it. That choice has several possible readings. The story may have been too foundational to remove, embedded deep enough in the cultural substrate that excising it would have required rewriting too much of everything else connected to it. Or the scribal tradition, which traced its lineage to Enki's domain of craft and technical knowledge, preserved the loophole deliberately as a record of the method, kept alive inside the very institutions that served the authority the method had outmaneuvered. or the priestly administration overseeing the schools found the story useful in ways that outweighed the discomfort of keeping it. All three may be true at once. That is how institutional memory works. A text survives not for one clean reason, but because removing it would cost more than keeping it. The loophole becomes acceptable content once the institution controls how it gets framed. But here is the detail that changes the scale of what you are looking at. The wall speech was not a unique invention. Legal and administrative documents from the Old Babylonian period, contemporary with the Atrahasis tradition, reveal practices of embedding protected content inside formulaic ritual language that technically satisfied institutional requirements while transmitting meaning the literal surface did not fully contain. The structure had precedent. The workaround was not extraordinary. It was a recognizable pattern in how knowledge moved inside systems designed to control it. The reed fence was one instance of something that already had a grammar. The wall was not a metaphor, it was a method, and the method had been used before. What Enki did was procedural. He found the seam between the letter of the prohibition and the function of transmission. He spoke to the wall and let the wall carry the information forward. The message arrived. The oath was technically preserved. The record of both the prohibition and the circumvention survived in the same document. The Atrahasis text is preserving a technique, not only an event. Think about what that means for the institution that kept copying it. The temple scribal schools were not simply archiving folklore. They were transmitting, generation by generation, a story that demonstrated exactly how knowledge passes through a sealed prohibition. And the story itself used the method it was describing. The form and the content were the same thing. Then the flood ends. This is where the official version reasserts itself. The waters recede, the gods survey the damage, some form of divine reconciliation occurs, and the narrative closes on themes of survival and uncertain mercy. The theological framing absorbs the aftermath and leaves the procedural machinery of what came before quietly in the background, present but unremarked. But the text does not do that cleanly. After the flood, something specific happens in the surviving account. Enlil arrives at the boat. He finds Atrahasis alive. His anger is not vague. It is the anger of a governing authority that understands that if the man survived, someone inside the council must have enabled it. He demands an accounting. What follows reads less like divine fury than like an assembly conducting a formal examination of a prohibition that was violated. And then Enki himself speaks. In the surviving text, it is Enki, known also as Ea in his Akkadian name, who rises in the aftermath and addresses Enlil directly. He does not wait to be denounced. He explains his own mechanism. He sent no direct warning. Only a dream. Only the sound of a wall. The one who defied the prohibition steps forward and names himself, and in doing so, names the method. This is where the story stops being about mercy and starts being about something considerably harder to absorb. The institution recorded the circumvention. The institution recorded the accountability. And the institution recorded them together, in the same clay, in the same hand. Who decided that should survive? That is what this has been building toward. The reed wall stands in the dark. The whispered words move through it. The man behind the fence hears what the god was careful never to say directly to him. And later, when the water has receded and the assembly reconvenes, Enki speaks his own name into the record, explains the mechanism, names the loophole, and the scribes write it down. The text does not let the method disappear. It makes the method its own evidence. The assembly did not convene in chaos. That is the detail almost nobody pauses on. When Enlil arrived at the boat and found Atrahasis breathing, the divine council did not dissolve into noise. What the text records is procedural. Accusations were made. A body deliberated. Enki stepped forward and explained himself. The structure of what followed the flood was not theological drama. It was institutional accountability, moving through recognizable forms. The Anunnaki assembly had mechanisms for managing a situation where a prohibition had been circumvented from within. One of its members had found the gap, transmitted the prohibited knowledge, and survived the reset that was supposed to have prevented exactly that. And when the moment came, Enki named himself. In the Gilgamesh Tablet 11 version of this aftermath, the best-preserved account, it is Ea who speaks, defending his own actions to Enlil, describing the dream and the wall, explaining that no oath was technically broken. It is a formal defense offered inside a deliberating body. The precision is deliberate. Enki does not confess. He makes an argument. He explains the mechanism of the loophole to the authority that issued the prohibition inside the assembly that enforced it, in language calm enough to be copied. This matters because it means the flood narrative contains something more precise than mercy versus wrath. It contains a complete institutional sequence, a decision by an assembly, a sworn prohibition, a technical circumvention executed by a council member, consequences, and then the post-event self-accounting, the formal statement, inside the deliberating body, by the one who defied the agreement, of exactly how he did it, and why the oath remained intact. Beginning to end, this is governance documentation. The water is almost incidental. The three structural elements that should stop anyone reading this text carefully are not the flood, the boat, and the survival. They are the oath, the wall, and the speech. That triad is not decorative. It is the skeleton of the document, and it is a governance skeleton, not a theological one. To understand what that means fully, you need to understand what the Anunnaki actually were in Sumerian institutional language, not in the theological framing, but in the conceptual structure of how Mesopotamian civilization organized authority. In Sumerian administrative language, the Anunnaki functioned as the decision-making assembly with jurisdiction over the foundational conditions of organized life: land allocation, water rights, flood control infrastructure, city founding rights, labor systems, and the distribution of the me. That last word is the one that changes everything. The me, translated variously as divine decrees, sacred formulas, or the technical powers of civilization, were the collected operational knowledge of organized society. The list in Sumerian literature is specific: kingship, priesthood, the scribal art, the craft of the metalworker, the building of cities, the practice of law, descent into the underworld. Not abstract virtues, institutional competencies, the technical and procedural knowledge that made a functioning society possible. And the me were held by Enki, cataloged, stored in his underwater temple complex, the Abzu at Eridu. The god of technical knowledge held custody of the operational infrastructure of civilization, not the commanding authority, not the storm god, but the water god, the engineer, the scribe patron. Read the flood story with that in mind. Enlil decides humanity must be destroyed and issues a council-level prohibition on warning them. What he is functionally doing is ordering a reset of the human order, while the person who holds the operational knowledge of how that order works has been bound by oath not to protect it. The institution with command authority is ordering erasure. The institution with technical knowledge has been legally prohibited from intervening. This stops being about water entirely. This is a story about what happens to the stored knowledge of a civilization when the administrative authority above it decides to end everything and start again. Who controls the infrastructure competencies during a catastrophic institutional reset? Who survives with the information intact? and who decided which of those things would be permitted. Enki walked to the wall because the alternative was the complete destruction of the human capacity for organized life. The flood was not simply punitive. In the governance logic embedded in the text, it was a total administrative reset. And the me, the technical formulas, the knowledge infrastructure, sat in a temple at Eridu with a god who had just agreed not to use them to stop it. The whisper through the reed fence was not only saving one man, it was the knowledge infrastructure finding a path around the reset. Now the official version begins to reveal its function. The mythology framing strips the governance logic out almost entirely. It converts the Anunnaki from an administrative assembly into a pantheon of arbitrary deities. It converts the me from institutional operational knowledge into divine gifts. It converts Enki's loophole, the precise, procedurally executed circumvention of a sworn prohibition, into an act of compassion. What that framing erases is specific, the recorded fact of institutional dissent inside a governing council. The documented mechanism for transmitting prohibited knowledge in a form that technically satisfies the prohibition. The post-event self-accounting, in which the dissenting member explained the mechanism to the body that issued the prohibition. And the survival of all of this inside a copied, institutional text. The mythology framing is useful to any governing system that needs unchallenged divine authority as its foundational precedent. The Mesopotamian priestly administrative class, which governed water distribution, grain taxation, and labor conscription, and built its institutional authority on the precedent of divine command, did not need a legible record of a god who found the seam in a council prohibition and survived accountability for circumventing it. A god who defied the divine order and was vindicated by the facts is a different precedent than a god who acted through arbitrary divine will and extended gracious mercy. The first version opens questions. The second closes them. The story survived because it was too foundational to remove, but the interpretation was managed. The legal precision of Enki's method was absorbed into the theology of divine will. The loophole became mercy. What remained in the popular understanding was the miracle, not the mechanism. But here is where the text becomes stranger and more deliberate than the mythology framing can absorb. The me had escaped institutional control once before, not during the flood. Earlier. The goddess Inanna traveled to Eridu, to Enki's Abzu, and in the course of a banquet, the versions suggest Enki had been drinking, she received the me from him. All the operational formulas of civilization transferred in a single encounter. She carried them to her city, Uruk. Enki sent his divine messengers after her, the creatures of the Abzu, the guardians of his deep temple. But they could not stop her. The me arrived in Uruk and passed out of Enki's custody into the broader institutional fabric of Mesopotamian civilization. The scribes recorded that story too, and kept it. If this were an isolated incident, one story, one escape, one anomalous transmission, it could be read as coincidence in the mythological record. But two separate narrative complexes involving the same god, the same category of knowledge, and the same pattern of institutional control failing to contain it. That is a tradition making a claim. It is the scribal culture preserving a record of how its foundational competency behaves under institutional pressure. The me does not stay locked. Knowledge of this kind, held by the technical class and coveted by the administrative class, finds a way through. What this means, alongside the flood narrative, is that there is a pattern in the Sumerian textual tradition, not a single incident, but a recurring structure. Enki's knowledge keeps moving beyond the institution that holds it. It gets transferred in a banquet. It gets whispered through a wall. It escapes, by one mechanism or another, from the controlled space where it is stored and into the larger world where it becomes functional for people who had no administrative access to it. This pattern was not accidental. It was copied deliberately by scribes working inside temple schools, preserved in multiple versions across centuries, written in Akkadian and Sumerian both, circulated across the same cities whose priestly hierarchies built their authority on divine mandate and institutional command. The people copying these texts were trained readers, working in institutions that existed precisely because reading and writing were technical competencies requiring formal instruction. The scribal tradition was Enki's tradition. Students learned their craft under the patronage of the god of the scribal art, the god who spoke to walls and let knowledge pass through them. The question the official framing has never needed to answer is whether preserving the flood story intact, with the loophole exact, with the wall speech precise, with Enki's own self-accounting included, was a deliberate choice by people who understood what they were transmitting. Whether the scribes copying these tablets across 3 and 4 centuries knew they were preserving a record of how prohibited knowledge survives institutional suppression. Whether the mechanism and the story about the mechanism were the same thing, and whether the people doing the copying knew they were practicing the method they were preserving. The colophons name the copyist and the source tablet. They do not annotate the loophole. But the pattern of preservation is its own kind of evidence. The wall speech was not softened into metaphor. The oath was not omitted. Enki's defense of his own mechanism was preserved beside the record of his workaround, as if whoever maintained the tradition understood that the complete sequence, prohibition, circumvention, accountability, was the content. The form of the transmission and the content being transmitted were the same instruction. Go back now to the image at the opening. The reed fence, the dark, a god who had agreed not to speak to the man behind it, standing close to the wall, speaking anyway. What the text records is something like this. Wall, listen to me. Reed wall, pay attention. The man sleeps. The words move through the woven reeds. He hears, he builds, he survives. That image has changed entirely. It is no longer a moment of divine grace in an ancient religious narrative. It is a documented instance of prohibited knowledge transmission, executed by a member of a governing council against the explicit sworn agreement of that council, using a procedural mechanism that satisfied the formal letter of the prohibition while violating its function completely. The man survived because the mechanism worked. The knowledge infrastructure survived the reset. And then someone wrote it down. Someone copied it. Someone copied the copy. And each copy carried the wall. Each transmission of the tradition about how prohibited knowledge passes through institutional barriers was itself an act of transmission through institutional barriers. The method was encoded in its own record. The reed fence was not just in the story, it was the story's own structure. The tradition was gathered into the library at Nineveh, in the palace of Ashurbanipal, copied and assembled across the ancient Near East in the 7th century BCE. When that library burned, when the Babylonians and Medes sacked Nineveh in 612 BCE and the building fell, the tablets were fired a second time by the catastrophe meant to destroy them. The clay hardened. The text survived. It came out in fragments, barely legible, until 19th century excavations brought it to the British Museum, where the wall speech was pieced together again, where Enki's self-accounting was recovered from the damaged surface. The speech that named the method did not end the record. It became part of it. The suppressed transmission, the procedural loophole, the formal self-accounting, all of it written into clay, fired accidentally into permanence, surviving the destruction of the institution that preserved it, sitting now in a museum case, still containing the exact structure of what was spoken to a wall in the dark. What was hidden in the wall was not only a warning, it was the proof that the warning was hidden. It was the record of the method. It was the demonstration, encoded in the oldest written narrative tradition we possess, that institutional prohibitions have seams, that knowledge finds them, and that the act of writing down how that happens is itself a way of making sure it keeps happening. Someone made sure that proof survived. Look at what they did to keep it.